By the early 1830s, Britain governs an empire that depends on Caribbean sugar and African labor, but it no longer controls the political meaning of that system. Debates about slavery have circulated for decades, but they remain abstract for most of the public. Distance allows violence to be described as discipline and plantations to be described as order. Jamaica changes this relationship by producing events that cannot be contained as local disturbances. The Baptist War turns plantation management into a national issue. Reports from the island describe large-scale participation, rapid spread, and mass punishment. These accounts do not come only from officials and planters. They come from missionaries, soldiers, and merchants who send letters and testimonies to Britain. Information arrives in written form that can be read aloud, copied, and circulated. Control over narrative begins to shift away from colonial authorities. The British government cannot ignore these reports because they affect credibility as well as policy. Jamaica is one of the most valuable colonies in the empire. It is also one of the most heavily enslaved. If it requires permanent military suppression, then slavery is no longer simply an economic arrangement. It becomes a security risk. Parliamentary committees begin to treat the island as a test case rather than an exception. Abolitionist organizations use the events in Jamaica to argue that slavery produces instability rather than profit. They point to the scale of participation and the level of force required to restore order. They publish missionary letters describing executions, destroyed chapels, and mass arrests. These documents transform suffering into evidence. Slavery is presented not as a moral problem alone, but as a system that fails under pressure. Planter interests respond by reframing the conflict. They argue that the rebellion is not caused by slavery, but by interference. Missionaries and literacy are blamed for spreading false expectations. Reform in Britain is accused of encouraging unrest in the colonies. The conflict is therefore moved from plantations to Parliament. Control over labor becomes a debate over authority. The government faces a practical dilemma. It must maintain order in Jamaica while avoiding further escalation. Troops are expensive. Militia service disrupts production. Constant repression increases the chance of future resistance. At the same time, sudden emancipation risks economic collapse and planter opposition. Policy becomes a calculation of timing and compensation rather than principle. Public opinion now enters this calculation. Newspapers report on trials and executions. Pamphlets reproduce missionary testimony. Meetings are held in industrial towns where sugar is consumed, but slavery is not seen. The empire becomes present in daily conversation. Jamaica is no longer distant. It becomes an example. This pressure changes how ministers speak about slavery. They no longer defend it as permanent. They describe it as transitional. Reform is framed as necessary to prevent repetition of violence. The argument shifts from whether slavery should end to how it can end without provoking disorder. The British state begins to prepare for a managed abolition. Compensation for slave owners is designed to prevent financial collapse and political resistance. An apprenticeship system is proposed to control labor during the transition from slavery to wage work. Emancipation is presented as regulation rather than rupture. These plans depend on Jamaica's instability. Without the rebellion, delay remains plausible. With it, delay appears dangerous. The island's size, wealth, and population make it impossible to dismiss. What happens there suggests what could happen elsewhere. Policy is shaped by fear of spread rather than by local conditions alone. Planters attempt to preserve authority by promising reform on their own terms. They introduce limited improvements in food and punishment. They argue that management can be improved without ending slavery. These measures are read in Britain as concessions rather than solutions. The system appears to be changing under pressure, not by design. For missionaries, Jamaica provides proof that religious teaching has political consequences. They argue that literacy and worship do not create rebellion but expose injustice. Their role shifts from pastoral to political. They become witnesses for a case against slavery rather than neutral observers. Their presence in Parliament turns colonial events into metropolitan debates. The enslaved population in Jamaica does not control this process directly. Their actions shape it indirectly by forcing attention. The rebellion does not reach Britain as a demand. It arrives as a crisis. British policy responds to instability rather than to organized appeal. The abolition bill that follows is therefore a product of shock rather than consensus. It reflects an attempt to regain control over events that have escaped colonial management. Emancipation is treated as a way to prevent further rebellion by restructuring authority rather than surrendering it. When the decision is taken, it is justified in terms of order and economy as much as justice. Slavery is described as unsustainable rather than simply wrong. The empire presents abolition as reform rather than defeat. Jamaica becomes the reason that reform can no longer wait. The shockwaves do not end with legislation. They alter how Britain understands its colonies. Violence in Jamaica demonstrates that imperial rule depends on cooperation as well as coercion. The cost of governing through fear becomes visible. Slavery is no longer a distant institution. It is a political liability. In this way, Jamaica forces abolition onto the imperial agenda without sending representatives or petitions. Its disruption becomes a signal that the existing system cannot continue. The island's rebellion becomes Britain's problem. The decision to abolish slavery does not end conflict. It reorganizes it. Compensation shifts loss from planters to taxpayers. Apprenticeship delays freedom while claiming it. Authority remains in colonial hands. But the principle changes. Slavery moves from accepted foundation to managed exit. Shock in Britain is therefore not emotional alone. It is administrative. Jamaica demonstrates that the empire cannot hold slavery steady. It must either transform it or face repeated crises. Policy chooses transformation as the safer path. The rebellion in Jamaica does not dictate the form of abolition, but it sets its urgency. It turns debate into timetable. It makes delay appear reckless. What had been argued for years becomes necessary within months. By the time emancipation is announced, it is justified as prevention as much as progress. The empire claims to be acting in advance of disaster rather than in response to defeat. Jamaica's instability becomes the proof that slavery has reached its limit as a system of rule. The shockwaves do not travel as sympathy, they travel as warning. A colony once valued for its sugar now matters for its danger. That change in meaning forces a change in policy. Slavery is not abolished because it is weak. It is abolished because it is too costly to hold.